I'm Steve Wilkerson, and I'm with David Royse, Executive Editor of the News Service of Florida. David, Governor Scott has released his budget recommendations for the 2013 session. It differs a little bit from his first budget and even in its form of presentation.
Yes, this is a pretty feel-good budget for a guy who came into office 2 years ago saying he was going to slash the heck out of government. And in fact, his first budget a couple years ago, Governor Scott didn't even unveil it in Tallahassee. He went to a Tea Party rally down in Central Florida in Eustis to highlight the fact that he was kind of anti-government, you know. He was coming in talking about cutting jobs in state government and cutting spending and several billion-dollar shrinkage in the budget that year in his first budget. So this week, this past week, Governor Scott stands up here in Tallahassee among the insiders that he once said he didn't like, and he says we're going to increase he's proposing an increased budget, $74.2 billion budget, which is almost $4 billion larger than it was last year. So this is this is maybe Governor Rick Scott 2.0. He's not quite about cutting the size of government so much as he was 2 years ago.
Revenue estimates would support that?
Yeah, and that's what Governor Scott would say. Well, look, this is no, this is not trickery. This is the fact is the economy's getting better, and we're bringing in more tax dollars. And we've taken a couple of years where, we've taken some years off from spending on some things that we've needed to spend money on, and now it's just time to put some of that money back. Education is probably a good example of that. I mean, his first year in office, Governor Scott signed a budget that cut the education budget by $1 billion. Last year, they put that billion back, and now education is probably the highlight of the governor's proposed budget for the year. He's got a $1.2 billion increase in education spending, which the education establishment looks at and says, wow, this is great. We like this guy, which a lot of people would say that's the point. Governor Scott is going into a re-election year, one group of people that Republicans have had trouble with has been teachers. The teachers union and a lot of rank and file teachers as well have not taken kindly to cuts in education over the years and to a system where they've been increasingly measured against performance measurements that they've sometimes chafed at. So this year's budget has a nice little piece in there for teachers, a $2,500 raise. And
you were talking last week, it's across the board. It's
That's right.
Not linked to merit necessarily.
That's right. That's right. It's a $2,500 across the board raise that he's proposing for teachers. Now, this is just a recommendation from the governor, and the legislature. Senate President Don Gates last week said the governor proposes and the legislature disposes, and that's very often what happens. They kind of take a look at this proposal and they say, well, we'll start over.
Did you think that Senator Gates's or President Gates's response indicates a lukewarm reception to this idea of an across-the-board teacher pay raise?
I would say that's a fair characterization. I think at first they didn't know how to respond because I think they were kind of caught off guard by this recommendation. But I think, yeah, it's a lukewarm recommendation. There's a lot of, in the legislature, especially the Republicans in the legislature, they kind of like the merit pay idea. I mean, they just spent several years trying to get that passed. And so an across-the-board pay raise is kind of like, well, what's that all about? But, there's other things in this budget that that make Governor Scott kind of look like Santa Claus. I mean, state pay workers haven't
Did you ever think you'd say that about Governor Scott?
No, and neither did a lot of the people who voted for him in 2010, I don't think. But, $1,200 bonus for state workers. I mean, Governor Scott came in basically saying government is not the answer. Our state government is way too big, and state workers have felt very underappreciated in the early years of the Scott administration. Now, it goes back beyond that. State workers haven't had a raise in 6 years. They did have one bonus a few years ago, but Governor Scott is proposing a $1,200 raise for Basically everybody who does minimally well on their evaluations, and then the possibility of higher bonuses for state workers who do even better. So there's another group that have not particularly liked Governor Scott over the years, and now he's got something for him this year. The list continues. There's environmentalists. Governor Scott has said, well, after taking a few years off, let's put some more money into Florida Forever, which is a big land buying program where the state buys land to keep it out of development. $75 million proposal for that. After years where they've barely put any money into buying land at all, last year Governor Scott proposed $15 million for that. So that's a huge increase. He wants to put a bunch of money into Everglades cleanup. The environmentalists, I think, had to pick their jaws up off the floor after Governor Scott released his budget. There's more money for the developmentally disabled. It's a gift bag budget proposal.
Well, another group that will like some of his budget proposals and some of other proposals are college students.
That's right. And you think about college students, you know, one of the things that Republicans who have looked back at the last couple of elections, both 2010 and 2008, trying to figure out what went wrong with the election of President Obama in particular in 2008, but then also his recent re-election, you know, Republicans have had a hard time with younger voters, including college students. And well, I don't know if this was the goal or not, but Governor Scott has talked an awful lot about keeping tuition low. He's asked state colleges, which is what used to be called community colleges, the state colleges, he's asked them if they can provide $10,000 degrees. The full price, full 4-year degree would be $10,000 or less. And several colleges say they're going to try to do that. Something that came along with his budget proposal was a proposal that state universities freeze tuition for 4 years for each student. In other words, lock in the tuition rate. If you come in and you're charged a certain amount in your first year, you ought to be paying the same amount of tuition by the time you finish, and if you finish in 4. So, you know, some students start and, you know, the tuition is X amount a year, and then 4 years later it's gone up quite a bit. Governor Scott wants tuition to be kept low the full 4 years. And, you know, I don't know if that's you know, sort of looking out to college students as, you know, a group that he might be able to get on board with the frugal Republican message, or if he just thinks that college costs too much, which is what he says, that could be the case. But so anyway, there's another thing in the budget that you know, I think a lot of people will be like, wow, that sounds great. Again, see what the legislature does.
Well, Secretary of State Ken Detzner has released his recommendations this week about how to once again reform Florida's election process. What was in those recommendations?
It's deja vu all over again, kind of. I mean, because a lot of it goes back to the way the law was before the legislature changed it a couple of years ago, amid some warnings that this was a bad idea. So, of course, the thing that's going to get the most attention is Secretary of State Detzner says that some of the long lines that we saw on Election Day may have been avoided had we had more days of early voting. Of course, a couple of years ago, they reduced the number of early voting days from 14 to 8, and now the Secretary of State says maybe we should have more early voting days, maybe 14. So that's just a reversal of what they've done. They've also suggested, and I should point out that this is not just Secretary of State Detzner. They went out and asked supervisors of elections around the state. Keep in mind, there are 66 elected supervisors of elections around the state and 1 appointed supervisor. Okay, so what are some of the suggestions for how we fix elections? And a lot of this is listening to those supervisors. The Secretary of State's report pretty much mirrors what the supervisors have said. They've also said, first of all, more places where people can vote, particularly in early voting. You know, if you have more polling places, easier for people to vote. They've also talked about you know, giving supervisors more ability to make decisions at the local level in terms of things like the number of actual voting stations at the polling place and also the number of polling places. Then there's one other suggestion which I think might be controversial, and that is to reduce the length of ballot questions on the ballot. There were 11 proposed constitutional amendments on the ballot this past year. Some of them were very long and difficult to read. A lot of supervisors said they thought that was part of what made the voting lines so long. I would say that there is not universal agreement on this, and there's also some discussion in the Senate in particular that this might not be something they go along with, reducing the length of these proposed ballot amendments by making a shorter summary. You know, it's been the way it is for several years, and I heard Senator Jack Latvala, who's the chairman of the Elections Committee in the Senate, say this past week, you know, it's only this year that it seems to have gone wrong. I don't know if we want to throw out, you know, 10 years of normal voting because one year we got it difficult. We had a difficult time. So that one might be controversial, but a lot of this is going back to what we saw before the Republican-led legislature changed the voting laws a couple of years ago. So now we're talking about going backwards, and it'll be interesting to see if they actually follow through on this.
Thank you, David. For more about Florida politics and government, visit the Advances section of our website.